Hello, welcome back to another edition of the SportsPro Podcast. This week we are dishing out some awards. As ever, half-year awards, you know, that well-known staple of podcasting and just general life, I think. But to do so, I'm lucky enough to be joined by a couple of people who are probably a bit more qualified to do this than I am. Ed Dixon, SportsPro's Deputy Editor. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure, mate. And I'm also joined by Sam Carp, who is SportsPro's Features Editor.
Cheers for having me on. Hopefully our awards are more agreeable than our most marketable 11, but we'll see.
It's very casual awards. I've left my DJ at home.
Yes, these are some casual awards. This is not a black tie affair, it's fair to say.
No trophies?
We can decide on trophies. It's not really in the SportsPro Podcast budget, but maybe next year.
Certificates. Let's make certificates and send them out over email. I think that's kind of more sustainable as well.
Funky pigeon certificates.
Yeah.
We could probably just make something on like Microsoft Paint. So yeah, if you're a lucky award winner, you'll get something I designed on Microsoft Paint, maybe with some clip art.
Not a guarantee.
It's not a guarantee. No, it's also if I have your email address. And if I don't, send it in and I'll maybe send you something I made on Microsoft Paint. But right, after that, I'd say a Gervais-esque intro to the award show. Our first award is for Executive of the Year so far. We're in July. We're a little bit beyond half. I can't say half year every time. So Executive of the Year so far. I wonder how this will tally against our 10 influencers of the year. I haven't actually double checked that. As you can tell, I'm really, really good at presenting award shows.
Playing dumb for a lot of this, Tom.
Yeah, which isn't good when you have me on the podcast if you're the one who's playing dumb.
What we'll do is we'll just act as a sort of on-air nominations committee. So if you fellas have got a suggestion for Executive of the Year so far, we can discuss. Maybe, Ed, if you kick us off here.
Yep, sure. Mine might be a bit divisive, but start as you mean to go on, I guess. I've gone for Turki Al-Sheikh, who is chairman of Saudi Arabia's General Entertainment Authority.
You can't just tell me his name, mate. You need to tell me why he's nominated.
Well, considering the impact he's had, I'm quite surprised you aren't going, yes, of course. We'll get into the good and the bad of what he's done, but I think, so in sum, he is heading up Saudi Arabia's push into boxing. And if Saudi Arabia and the PIF's intention was to change sport and sort of put them in the driving seat, in this case with boxing, then they've done it. And it hasn't taken very long either, which probably says a lot about how boxing is run. Just this year alone, he's brought the sport's biggest promoters together who said they would never work together. He has staged in Riyadh the first undisputed heavyweight world title fight in the four-belt era. There have been reports of a $5 billion pro boxing league. The money is now from Saudi. That's where the biggest purses are. Saudi Arabia has completely transformed the sport in less than a year, and he's been at the forefront of that.
If there was a sport that was going to be pretty easy to transform, it is boxing, though. Largely a collection of disparate and unlinked championships, only really united by the fact that it's big blokes who are quite interesting to watch punch each other.
Well, that's perhaps quite a flippant take on it, Tom. But I think actually, yes, your point about it being a sport that's easy to disrupt is valid because there is no centralised governing body. The power is lied with the promoters, and there are multiple alphabet bodies that award belts. They all go. The point is, they all go where the money is. The promoters have the power. The alphabet bodies, they like their sanctioning fees. So the more world title fights they can stage, the bigger cut they can get, stuff like that. So they all gravitate to where the money's going. And in this case, it's Saudi Arabia. So actually, it is quite a shrewd move. Of course, for some people, the downside might be the accusations of sports washing. There's the human rights element, obviously, that of course we do need to consider. But your average boxing fan is seeing fights that they never thought they were going to see, and they look like they're going to be seeing even more. So just purely from a competitive standpoint, the sport has received a shot in the arm that it hasn't had in decades.
And Ed Dixon is the boxing man of the office, I'd say. But Ed actually called this, a year, 2 years ago in your column, which people can probably go back and read. And it's a good bit of soothsaying from Ed in that column. But I think the point that you made about the money is probably the most important one, in that the reason that these fights that are finally being made that haven't happened for years, the sticking point has always been money, whereas now Saudi Arabia coming in with a bottomless pit of cash is able to kind of just bypass all of that and make the fights happen. And, people like Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren, who've previously been sparring, are happy to smile and kind of put their differences aside, knowing that they're going to get a massive paycheck at the end of it. So my only question really in considering Al Sheikh for kind of our half year award here is a question of, whether it's kind of a case of good executiving, or is it a case of, I've just got the money to make this happen? I think I don't necessarily feel like there's been much of a test of him as a sports executive yet. So perhaps that will come further down the line. And I think also an interesting thing to consider on top of the sort of human rights questions that always come up when we talk about Saudi Arabia in sport that Ed already mentioned is kind of your average boxing fan can't necessarily go to Saudi Arabia to watch these fights. There's been chat about the kind of atmosphere in the stadiums. I'm not convinced that this is about growing boxing in Saudi Arabia. I think it's more about projecting an image of Saudi Arabia by being able to stage these money-spinning fights. So those are kind of other things which I'd consider in this, and kind of, I guess, just maybe put on the column against giving him
yeah, one thing they are doing is they're taking Riyadh season abroad. So Terence Crawford is going to fight, I think it's in August, in Vegas, but obviously presented by Riyadh season. And then Anthony Joshua's got his dust up against Daniel Dubois in September at Wembley again. It's a Riyadh season card. So the power is lying with Saudi Arabia, but that, as you say, that global influence is now going into other countries. But I think, yeah, without wanting to talk myself out of my own argument, which is very affable of me, but I think, yeah, has he been tested? I mean, you could argue the fact that he has got Hearn and Warren in a room together is kind of a test in itself. But again, the fact that he's sitting on billions of dollars might have made it slightly easier to sort of get them in. It's not like he's bungled them into the back of a van. But again, without wanting to beat the drum for Saudi Arabia, which I don't think was the point of this podcast, I'd like to hear who you have, Sam.
Yeah, I bounced around for this because I was kind of like, do we want to choose an executive who has generated the most headlines? So you could probably talk about like Jim Ratcliffe. He's been an executive who's just been constantly in the news since his minority investment in Man United went through. Or do we want to talk about people who've been doing a good job, which is kind of where I landed, I think, and ended up.
I think if you're awarding someone a prize, it has to be for doing a good job. It can't just be for headlines. Because I mean,
crap ideas.
Like Vladimir Putin creates a lot of headlines, but they're not necessarily good ones.
Shout out to Vlad on the pod if you're listening. Bloody hell.
You'll be glad to hear that I didn't end up choosing Ratcliffe. I want to give a shout out to, well, highly commended is a phrase that I've become familiar with, to British Cycling Chief Executive John Dutton, who I think has had a really good first half of the year. We don't really talk about national governing bodies that much on this podcast, but I think British Cycling was in a really tough place when he took over, was getting loads of criticism over its sponsorship deal with Shell, rightly, and kind of a lot of disillusionment among its members, and also its biggest event, the Tour of Britain, was at risk of collapse. First 6 months have seen the Women's Tour of Britain go ahead. They saved that. Also signed a new sponsorship deal worth £20 million reportedly with Lloyds Bank. So I think John Dutton's doing a really good job there, and wanted to give him a shout out. You could probably also throw Caitlin Clark's agents at XL Sports Management into the mix, but landed on someone who was in our 10 influencers, in Jimmy Pitaro at ESPN. So I kind of think when we included him in that list, we spoke about some of the big media rights deals that were coming this year. And I think, within a month of that, he'd secured a couple of them. So the deal with the NCAA, which they kind of got for a bargain, really, $920 million over 8 years, includes Women's March Madness, which, as we saw, continues to drive huge viewership. Followed that up with the college football playoff deal. They also did what Warner Bros. Discovery didn't with the NBA. I know it's not official yet, but by all accounts, they kind of got in there early and renewed their deal for that property, which kind of has set them up really well for the rest of the year as they kind of plan for that shift to making ESPN full D2C launch, trying to attract strategic partners for that. So I think kind of the moves that he made at the very start of the year stood that company in really good stead for what's to come.
For Jimmy Pitaro, it would almost be hard to judge like how effective. I mean, that's some, I think, really, really effective deal making for sure. Those are great properties and probably, as you said, will serve them well over the course of those contracts. The context with ESPN, I think, and especially Jimmy Pitaro, is this some kind of grand audition for the big job at Disney? It'd be really hard to know whether or not those purchases were effective, I think, until you start seeing what the future like revenue and business model looks like for ESPN in that big Disney makeup, because at the moment cable subs are still falling, so you couldn't really say great job Jimmy, your biggest slice of the pie is coming down. Not his fault, that's just the natural trends of the market over time, but it's going to be that transition, isn't it, over to full D2C, which will happen in 2025. there's also the other elements of their strategy and streaming to play into that. I think for me with Jimmy Pitaro, it's hard to know. Yes, done some great deal making, but he's done good deal making before. And that's why he's the chair of ESPN, right? He wouldn't be in the position if he was in without having done those deals. I almost think, are they a bare minimum?
You're going full Roy Keane. That's your job.
a little bit. That's your job. Whilst acknowledging that, yes, the comparison would be with someone like David Zaslav, who has utterly bungled this whole NBA situation and is now on the outside looking in.
That's what I mean, right? I think you probably have to look at it in that context, and that he's done everything that he could have done in the first 6 months of 2024 to ensure that ESPN is well positioned. Its sports portfolio is still as attractive as it can be going into that transition that's coming further down the line. So yeah, I know it's kind of hard to judge in that, but if we're judging him on this 6 month period alone, that's kind of why I think that you can put him forward, because ultimately those long-term targets and that long-term impact, that's a year-long award. I'm thinking about a specific 6 month window here.
No, so very true. In
terms of who's done those landmark deals, and I think he's the one who's probably done the most of them.
Yeah, I also like the Dutton shout as well. If we'd done this half-year awards even later, say in, 3 weeks' time, and we racked up a load of gold medals for GB in the cycling, then you'd probably be like, oh yeah, John Dutton probably deserves it even more. My suggestion, and this is something we do with our 10 influencers quite a lot, is almost using a competition as a proxy. But this is where I was I didn't know exactly which name to settle on. But I'm gonna go with Patrick Motsepe, who is the president of CAF. I think that if there was a tournament that did more than anything else to raise the profile of its region, it serve its teams, it was AFCON this year. Cut through in a way unlike previous AFCONs, I think, and that's a credit to the players. It's a credit to the host country, which I think helps Ivory Coast a little bit more developed in sort of stadium terms. But yeah, massive eyeballs for that tournament. Not some of the easy points that people would usually put against AFCON during that tournament, where occasionally you'll see uncompetitive games or half-filled stadia, or just stuff that's not quite on the same level as you'd expect, even from like a CONMEBOL or a UEFA for sure. It really felt like AFCON took a step forward this year, and you could put that on the local organising committee, 100%. You could put that on the Ivorian FA. They did sack their manager halfway through the tournament, didn't they?
They did, yeah.
For doing that and still winning. You could put that on many factors. Like, there were a lot of things that went into making a great tournament. But it does seem to me like CAF in the last couple of years has emerged from a tough period where FIFA had to be brought in to kind of overhaul the whole thing. Fatma Samora being parachuted in by Gianni. And it seems to have reached a kind of level of stability and confidence in itself. And that tournament was a reflection of that, which is why I picked out Patrice Motsepe.
I think that's a strong shout. Yeah, I mean, a healthy African football ecosystem is good for the wider game. Sort of a rising tide lifts all boats. I think, just going back to my one, if we want to, because I'm conscious how long we've been talking about this one already, and we've got a few to go. If we want to discount Turki Al Sheikh, I think what he's doing is good for Saudi Arabia, but is it good for wider boxing, in a sense that, yes, it's good for fans, but perhaps concentrating power into one country, or at least having the vast majority of influence there, may not be good for growth in other territories.
I love the way that you've started by arguing for your guy and then spent the
quick game's a good game, Tom. So I think realistically, best use of how to spend lots of money effectively in a sport rife for disruption goes to Turki Al Sheikh. Sticking to your remit goes to Jimmy Pitaro, and most arguably transformational executive would go to your pick, Tom.
I guess Motsepe as well. There's been a bit of chaos around the future AFCON dates as well in this last period, and buck ultimately lies with him for that. So that's kind of a mark you could put against his name, I think, especially delaying the women's AFCON as well. I think the second time that's happened kind of feels like, as much as they're sort of elevating the men's game, there's still kind of the women's game is quite far behind.
No, that's a good point.
Would it ever, and this is me just showing my ignorance, but would it ever be feasible to run AFCON the same time as the Euros or Copa America? Or is that just the way that African leagues fall, and where the setup is that they're trying to carve out specific space in the calendar because of all the other stuff that's coming on?
I think calendar wise it'd probably be fine. It's more geographical. So a lot of the places that they'd want to play would probably be too hot. It wouldn't quite work out from that perspective. I mean, that's why we had a World Cup in Qatar in the winter. Yeah, some of it would just be unplayable. It wouldn't be able to be very consistent. There is a reason why it's in the slot that it is at the moment. I don't know. This is what I always think about AFCON. Well, I don't know why it's every 2 years, but that's just me. I just like a little bit more. I feel like 4 years gives everything a little bit more of a sense of grandeur. But my personal takes on AFCON aside, I think probably it sounds like we've settled on Jimmy Pitaro for our executive of the year so far. Should we send Jimmy his paint created certificate?
I've heard he's waiting it anxiously, so we should probably get on with that, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Next on our list, and maybe we should have done this in reverse order, but oh well. Property of the year. Now, this could basically be anything you guys fancy. So you can have a league, club, organisation, basically anything that you can stick on a field and call a sport in and of itself. Sam, I'm going to start with you for this one.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking about leagues and also teams in this, and I thought, if we're going to give it to a property, then maybe we should think about a property that's won something in the first 6 months. I kind of bounced around from Real Madrid, who obviously won the Champions League and La Liga, had a look at the Boston Celtics as well, who have just won the NBA title and immediately got put up for sale, which you could say is quite good executiving from Wick Grasbeck. But then I kind of landed in Kansas City, not necessarily for the team that you would expect. But yeah, my sports property of the first half of 2024 is Kansas City Current, the women's soccer franchise. And I think when we talk about the NWSL, we often think about Angel City as kind of like the model for how like not only a women's soccer team, but a women's sports team should and can be run. But I think Kansas City Current have kind of slipped under the radar a little bit. Yeah, they joined the league around a similar time as Angel City in 2021. But what they've done in the first half of this year is they've basically opened the first purpose-built stadium exclusively for women's professional football. And what's more than that is that they're selling it out every week. I think building a venue like that is one thing. That's an achievement in itself. But I think being able to kind of like sustain the demand is another. So they're selling it out every week. They have a 3,000 person waiting list. They've designed it to make sure that capacity can be expanded over time. And some interesting details in the WSJ article that the average ticket costs $75, which for, we talk about women's football a lot and talk about how cheap the tickets are. Being able to price it at that kind of, maybe that's not premium in the US, but being able to price it at that high and still be able to sell out shows that people are willing to pay for women's football if the product is good enough and if the fan experience is good enough, which they're obviously producing with this new stadium. And they're also sitting second in the division at the moment, so they're supporting what they're doing off the pitch with their performances on it as well. And I think what's really interesting basically is that, having this stadium, it brings an element of control to where they're playing that other women's teams simply don't. A lot of women's teams rent or share facilities with men's clubs, so they kind of deprioritize a lot of the time. Whereas, Kansas City Current are going to be seeing all of those revenues that they generate through that venue. And Chris Long, who owns the team alongside his wife Angie, and also Patrick and Brittany Mahomes, said in that WSJ article that they're going to make $40 million in revenue this year. So I think when you consider that combined revenues for the WSL last year were around the 60 million mark, that's a really impressive number. And a lot of it comes down to kind of what they've done in the first half of 2024 and that venue they've opened.
Oh, it's a very, very strong argument. Ed, let's do your nomination and then we'll do mine.
Yeah, so I haven't gone for a women's sports team. I've actually gone for a women's sports league. So I've gone for the WNBA. I don't really want to make it just about Caitlin Clark because there are obviously other college stars, including Angel Reese, for example, who've now in the league. And there's loads of existing big names there anyway. But Clark's kind of been flavour of the month for several months, which is no small feat. And she's kind of spearheading, unprecedented interest in the league. They've had record viewership, higher attendances, games have been moved to bigger venues. I mean, it's not just the Indiana Fever and Clark, the Aces, they've sold out all their regular home season games. Engagement is up, the hype is up, and in Caitlin Clark, they've got one of the hottest properties in world sport. All the ingredients are there for profitability, and that's kind of got to be the next step, really. But there's probably never been a better time to be in the WNBA. And as I say, that next step is going to be perhaps not necessarily breaking away fully from the NBA, certainly not in the short term, but just relying on them and their sort of financial muscle to help prop up the league and maybe just make some more independent decisions, just be a bit more financially independent and cut back on losses.
I mean, the WNBA is, I think, to me, the outstanding candidate in this.
Yeah. And if you're looking at traffic on the SportsPro website as well, I think
reliable indicator of
tell the
quality.
same story as well. It's a good shout. We can come back to it. But yeah, Tom, who did you go for?
I've stuck to football. I've gone for Ipswich Town. A lot of attention gets paid to Wrexham, rightly. They're an interesting football club doing interesting things. Obviously, they've got celebrity owners and such like. But Ipswich Town are almost the sort of the model for, in recent years anyway, for what an investor can do with a lower league English football club, should they want to. They were bought, I think it was midway through, let me get this right, the 2021-2022 season. At that point, they were languishing in the third tier of English football, and they had not been good for, frankly, quite some time. It's not easy to accelerate up the English Football League. It's easier for Ipswich Town. They're a club that regularly sells out their home stadium, and which is really, really important when it comes down to lower league of English football, because matchday income is where you generate most of your revenue. It's not going to come from TV at that level. They took a bold decision on appointing an effective head coach in Kieran McKenna. Now, we don't talk much about performance on the SportsPro podcast, but part of running a good organisation is picking the right people to make your team successful, because making your team successful will ultimately be arguably the single biggest driving factor in how your team performs financially. Since then, Ipswich have gone on to achieve not just one, but 2 promotions, and they are now in a position where they were able to sell a chunk of the team for 105 million for a 40% stake, which valued the club at something like 300 odd million, right? So they've gone from investing probably what was some maximum in the tens of millions. I don't think that's ever come out or been confirmed what their original investment was.
How long have they been in League One for? It was over a decade, wasn't it?
ORG, who purchased the club when they were in League One, I think they'd only been relegated to League One maybe the season before or for a couple of seasons, but they've been struggling to get out, and since then they've gone through 2 promotions. Massively increased the value of their team in the club by coming up through the leagues. And next season will be in the Premier League, which for many people, Ipswich Town, really famous old club who won European trophies and have been in the Premier League in my lifetime, but had fallen on hard times. And that kind of level of turnaround isn't easy to do, and getting out of the Championship isn't easy to do. And look, you can say a lot of that is luck, and say that it comes down to having a good coach, and that could fall apart really at any moment. But you had to take advantage of it. They created a feel-good factor around that club. They utilise one of their biggest assets in Ed Sheeran, the pop star, to great effect. He's sponsored the team. He's regularly wheeled out for public appearances. He's raised money for them by performing before the takeover. All-round good job from Ipswich Town's owners. Now, I don't think that quite, for me, puts them past the WNBA, but I did think it was an interesting case to make, and one that was worth bringing onto into the nominations process.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think Ipswich sort of crossed my mind as well, because being able to get out of that division where, they were vying for 2 automatic promotion spots against 3 teams who essentially already had ready-made Premier League squads, and were able to fluff up those squads because of the parachute payments they benefit from. That kind of makes their achievement even greater, and is kind of testament to that new direction that they've had under the new ownership. So Ipswich, I'd say, highly commended as part of the first 6 months of 2024. My only thing with it is that we've seen stuff like that before with, even Southampton had double promotions, kind of reinventing fortunes on the back of some tough financial situations. So it's kind of, it's not that unprecedented, I don't think, what they've done. Whereas it feels like what's happening in the WNBA and women's basketball at the moment definitely is unprecedented, and there's kind of the level of viewership, the level of interest, and the level of, I guess, investment that's about to go into that sport definitely is unprecedented for that space. So well done, Caitlin Clark, and by association, the WNBA.
Yeah, the Caitlin Clark factor obviously is big, and I agree 100% that should be where we land on for Property of the Year. But I do think you can't just be the organisation that houses Caitlin Clark. You have to take advantage of it, and it was very clear from everything that the WNBA was saying beforehand and has done since that they've maximised that. Right, in that time, they've announced the launch of a new franchise, or not announced it, but it sounds like that's pretty much confirmed to happen in Toronto. They bumped up the value of their rights with all these kind of big increased audiences. Teams have been moving their games into bigger venues in order to do so. the league is involved in a lot of that stuff. Not all of it. Teams control a lot of it, but the league is involved a lot more than, say, the Premier League is here in terms of running Arsenal. But the WNBA is a lot more involved in running teams than the owners of the clubs are in English football, for example. So I do think you have to give some credit where it's due in that regard.
Yeah, I would say that I've just realised I might be trying to argue against my own choice again. No, but it's more just, I think, to kind of caveat it, we've spoken about the good, and there is a lot of it, absolutely. I think the way the NBA, the WNBA rather, it's not all sunshine and roses. The current model for the league is vastly different, is that the league operates under is vastly different from what it is now in terms of the cut that they get, in terms of the amount of revenue that reaches clubs and athletes. This wasn't for a league where it's had some games that have sold out more than 20,000, for example. So I think, for the first 6-7 months of the year, it's had a barnstorming start, but I'd be interested to see where it's at this time next year, because bearing in mind things like, players, they've expressed frustration over, I think, an apparent lack of transparency about the league's finances. They could even opt out of the current collective bargaining agreement before the 2025 season. So there are lots sort of spinning plates, most of them good, but I think there's a few crucial ones as well the WNBA is going to have to address, but it is in a strong position to do so.
Cool. All right. So I think we've settled then. Paint certificate going out to Kathy Engelbert and the kind folks at the WNBA. Right. Next one.
CC Caitlin Clark.
CC Caitlin Clark. She can have a prize of her own. I'm sure she will get one, not in the not too distant future. Sorry to interrupt your podcast. This is just a quick reminder that as a listener to the podcast, you can get a exclusive 10% discount on an annual SportsPro Plus membership. If you're not yet a SportsPro Plus member, I implore you to go and sign up. It's our subscription product. It's packed full of extremely important and very useful features, inclusive but not limited to our media hub, which features things like market spotlights, media rights trackers, quarterly deal analysis, all of our extensively researched and wonderfully produced commercial guides. SportsPro Plus readers also get access to our in-depth analysis of the biggest news in the sports industry. And as I said, SportsPro Podcast listeners can get an exclusive 10% discount now. That is if you use the code podcast10 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply, and that is for an annual subscription only. Thank you very much, and let's return to our regularly scheduled listening. Ed, deal of the year so far, sorry. Who you got?
I've gone for Netflix and the NFL getting Christmas Day games. So it's been valued at $75 million per game. That's a reported value. It runs until 2026.
That's quite a lot.
It is. Runs until 2026. Yeah, so it's global broadcast rights to at least one Christmas Day game per season. I think it slightly caught us off guard when it was announced. I think there have been a few murmurings, but you always take Netflix getting linked with live sports rights with a slight pinch of salt if you listen to what their CEOs have said. But let's be clear, Netflix, they can protest all they want in terms of where they see live sports, but, they're now in the big leagues. They're working with the richest sports property in the US, and this is a win-win for both parties. Netflix can use it to aid customer acquisition, and retention, support its advertising business. And for the NFL, they can, lean into Netflix's sort of comparatively youthful audience. Bearing in mind how much money they already make, they've just got this sort of seemingly insatiable appetite for revenue growth. So I think it's kind of two things. It's sort of reaffirming the NFL is not afraid of sort of expanding, tapping new revenue sources, and it puts Netflix up there as one of the sort of big players in sports streaming. And I think actually most sports properties are going to be hoping that their ambitions don't stop with the NFL either. So I think it's a deal that has consequences for wider sport, not just the NFL.
No, I think so. It's a good case. Sam, who have you got for this category?
Staying in media, but leaving the US for this one and going to India, where I think it was in February that basically confirmation of a mega merger between Disney and Reliance Industries, $8.5 billion deal, I believe basically brings together two huge players in the Indian sports broadcast market who together own a wide array of linear and digital platforms like Star Sports, Hotstar, Viacom 18, and lots of people will be familiar with those platforms because they are the ones which hold the linear and digital rights to the IPL in India, while they also have rights to Indian national team cricket and also ICC tournaments. And I've always kind of thought that having cricket rights in India is akin to having Premier League rights in the UK, NFL rights in the US. Basically, you're not a relevant player in that market unless you have that. So basically, I think one big advantage of this deal is that. Another big advantage of it is that, they'll no longer be in competition with each other when bidding for those rights. So basically stands them in good stead to sort of take on other domestic players like Sony, potentially even global platforms that might have been eyeing an entry to the market like Amazon and Apple, even Netflix, as Ed just mentioned. And then plus, I think the other thing is that because the pay TV market in India is relatively small, a lot of it relies on advertising revenue. The fact that they can now, combine those platforms, combine those audiences, means they're now going out with a much more attractive proposition for brands. And that's just kind of on the sports side of things. Like in the general entertainment side, there's big implications too. But that felt like a pretty big deal that happened in the first 6 months of 2024.
Another big deal that happened in the first 6 months of 2024, which I'm going to focus on, this might be the strongest case, is Liberty Media purchasing MotoGP. Now, the reason I think that this is the deal of the first part of the year only cost Liberty Media 4.5 billion. I like 4.5 billion is a lot of money, but given what Liberty Media has been able to do with Formula One, which, like, Formula One is definitely the more high-profile property, but MotoGP has a very different and distinct audience to Formula One, and it's not really been expanded. I don't feel like MotoGP has quite had it hasn't had the Liberty Media treatment. And the Liberty Media treatment in the last few years with Formula One has seen that property massively grow, add a whole host of high-profile races, increase its sponsorship revenue, increase its eyeballs, increase its TV rights revenue, launch a not unsuccessful, if not entirely successful OTT product, have a huge hit documentary series, which, I don't think that's going to happen again with any property. But I think that there's a lot of potential with MotoGP, and to get it at the price that Liberty Media did with their experience, for me, that is the best deal of 2024.
I don't disagree that it's a big deal, an important deal, but I don't know if it's necessarily the best. I think it's quite dangerous to assume that exactly what's worked in Formula One is then going to work in MotoGP. You've also got the question of whether is it a good idea to be managing two motorsport series at once. Can you dedicate enough resource and attention across the two of them to make sure they're both flourishing? And I also think with like Formula One, a lot of what they've done is they've obviously gone after the US quite significantly. They've also gone after kind of premium people who are fans of premium experiences quite a lot, and upgraded their hospitality offering, things like that, to attract basically people who are going to spend more money on the sport, which Formula One has always kind of had that image of itself, and that it does attract, because of the car makers involved, it does have that prestige. People want to be seen to be associated with it. I'm not necessarily sure that MotoGP has the same fan base. I'm not necessarily sure that same strategy is going to work. So yeah, my concern with that deal definitely would be that Liberty goes in with the same approach, same strategy, and it all comes crashing down. That's kind of one concern. Not to say that some of the things that they've implemented on the media and marketing side won't work, which I think is where they can probably drive the most value. But yeah, that would be kind of my caveat about that deal.
MotoGP is in a much different place to where Formula One was when it was bought by Liberty. Like F1, the way it operated was pretty archaic, particularly when it came to, as you mentioned, like digital media engagement and stuff like that. It was pretty minimal. I think MotoGP is in a different place. I don't think Liberty are naive enough to kind of say like it's a one-size-fits-all approach, but they will inevitably lean into some of what they've done in F1, which I don't think you can begrudge them for. It's just, as you said, Sam, it's like it will take a slightly more tailored approach. I mean, Lewis Hamilton's been linked with buying a team, and you can't, and I don't think Liberty will be too disappointed if that goes through with the potential for crossover. But as you say, it's got past form, but I think it's going to have to take a unique approach given where MotoGP is at. But I think it is a significant deal in terms of, I mean, I'm not saying it's going to be like something like the WWE and the UFC where you get crossovers and stuff like that. That's sort of sports entertainment stuff. But I think there's definitely scope for maybe cross promotion, things like that. I'm not saying you stick Valentino Rossi in an F1 car. They did try that, but stuff like that. But I'm excited to see what happens in terms of its significance, though. yeah, it's the classic bit of insight of we will see.
If you've got a better case to make on,
Let's put it to a vote, shall we? Let's see who's made the best case.
yeah,
Or
sure.
are you just deciding that yours is
No,
the
no,
biggest
I'm
deal?
not deciding. I do think
This
that
isn't a democracy, is it? I thought that's not how we do things.
I can take some cases against. I think that the India media one is very strong. I think to sort of single out Netflix for spending lots of money on NFL as a great deal is it could be. We don't know. It will probably bring in lots of eyeballs and lots of people will watch Netflix, but lots of people already watch Netflix and they don't have the NFL.
Lots of people watch the NFL as well.
They do. But it was a lot, and it's a lot of money for that kind of investment. So I think it may be even more interesting than Liberty Media, but I don't think it's necessarily a great deal, which is why I was like, it's a lot of money. Tam, if you think your Indian case is stronger, we could start pixelating in that paint certificate for the fine fellas over at Geo Cinema.
Yeah, I feel like I've made my case, but I think, the Indian broadcast market has such rich potential. It's such a massive market, and those two players are the most influential ones within it already, I'd say. And joining forces just kind of cements that position and super-proofs them against kind of like evolution in the future and what might be to come. To be honest, if we were to vote, would vouch for Netflix ahead of the MotoGP deal, only because I take your point, Tom, that it's a lot of money. It's not a lot of money for a company that's making nearly $10 billion in annual revenue, is a point that I would make. And I think I think you also have to take into account just the context of it, and that literally kind of less than a year ago, Netflix was saying it wasn't going to invest in live sport. It wasn't coming. We had the WWE deal, which kind of still blurred the lines a little bit because that's sort of entertainment. And then bam, we have the NFL deal. In terms of like shock factor and just the buzz that generated, I think that just feels like the deal of 2024 so far. I didn't feel that same sort of excitement and anticipation around Liberty MotoGP, and I'm not saying we should measure all deals against kind of excitement factor.
We should have probably had some criteria for these awards, which we failed to do.
In terms of what got the juices flowing in the newsroom, I think it was Netflix NFL.
Okay, all right. But I'm not going to labour this point. I actually think I might have been more tempted to go with. Might have been more tempted to join you. But if we'd gone the WWE Netflix deal, but Ed, are you voting for your own deal, or are you voting for another one? Sounds like Sam's voting for yours. So if you vote yours, you might have clinched it. Maybe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I vote Reliance, Disney.
Yeah, me too.
If we do go for that, bearing in mind we barely got our feet under the desk in the new year. I think the reports emerged that they agreed to merge on like the 1st or 2nd of January. May well be the biggest deal of the year so far.
Tactical voting. So your vote's redundant there. Let's move on.
Sounds like it has been. Well done, lads. One hastily prepared paint certificate coming your way. Right. Maybe this award, hopefully this award's quite close to your heart, Sam. Marketing campaign of the year. As the author of our bi-weekly and highly readable sponsorship and marketing newsletter, I think you're the right person to kick off the nominations.
Yeah, my issue with this award is that marketing campaigns are never as good described as they are to see. But so I'd urge our listeners to Google the campaigns that I say before I describe them, just so you can see what I'm talking about. But the first one I thought of was Molson's See My Name campaign, which they did for International Women's Day with the PWHL, another property that probably could have got in highly commended for the first 6 months of 2024. But yeah, basically they sponsored the space above the jerseys on the PWHL players' shirts, where basically their hair would usually block the names. So that meant that the player names could then appear below the number, so obviously generating more visibility for the players themselves and blocking out the sponsor logo. I think that was only for International Women's Day though, so I kind of moved away from that, and the one that I'm putting forward is Adidas's Typisch Deutsch, or typical German for those who aren't fluent like myself. Yeah, I thought that ad to launch Germany's home kit for the Euros was really clever. They basically challenged some of the stereotypes that I don't know, maybe people in Germany and people inside and outside of Germany have about the Germans, such as being on time, or their public transport being on time anyway, which I think a lot of fans at the tournament have found is definitely a stereotype that needs to be challenged. Also, things like being good at penalties. There were things appearing in there like an apartment block full of people with the surname Müller. So I think it was just like a really playful way to launch that kit. And it also kind of celebrated the diversity and difference within the national team. Yeah, it kind of felt like a good way to kick off the end of an era, which I've spoken about previously on this podcast and written lots about and keep referring back to, is the end of the DFB's deal with Adidas, with Nike set to take over in 2027. So yeah, felt like it dropped around that time. So it felt like a good kind of positive bit of marketing amidst a few negative headlines, basically.
That was my favourite of the Euros campaigns, I think. Ed, what was your campaign of the year?
Yeah, mine is the slogan is you can be anything, and it's for Mattel's role model Barbie dolls. I may not be the target market, but it got quite a lot of coverage when the products were unveiled earlier this year. So it's they've done 9 female athletes, immortalised as Barbie dolls. So they include Venus Williams, Mary Fowler, Christine Sinclair. Barbie, they've done role model dolls before with other famous faces. They've done singers and actresses, stuff like that over the years. But I think this effort specifically focusing on female athletes, and it's quite a diverse pool of athletes. Like there's a boxer from France, for example. It's not necessarily all, not all of them are necessarily a household name like Venus Williams either at the moment necessarily, but it's quite a sort of eclectic mix. The campaign itself, I think it was a socially conscious move on the brand's part, and it could easily come across perhaps as tokenism. But I think given Barbie's cultural impact as sort of a pop culture phenomenon that was reinforced after the movie that came out last year, I think the initiative is significant. I mean, obviously, this limelight on female athletes that can encourage young girls to participate in sports. But I think the move is going to benefit Mattel as well. Obviously, there's the chance for increasing sales and stuff like that, and perhaps sort of addressing the historical criticism. Most significantly, it has received in some quarters for sort of reinforcing traditional stereotypes against women. So I think the fact that you can be anything, I think has been a slogan that Barbie may have used before, but the fact that they're now applying it in a sporting sense and immortalising these female athletes, it's significant. And I think it just points more broadly to how women's athletes are kind of viewed in a commercial sense from big brands.
Interesting. Well, I'm shocked that you don't think Barbie has a for you, Ed. But my nomination, and it's another Euros ad, so I feel like I've already admitted defeat on this.
The second best Euros ad.
The second best Euros ad for me was Paddy Power's Europe's Favourites, which, and like Paddy Power, their marketing team, like they could probably win this every single year, the half year and the full year award, if it wasn't for the fact that they were promoting something that I don't know necessarily should always get that much marketing in betting. But it was a really good ad. Basically kind of, as Sam said, describing an advert is never as interesting as watching it. It plays on the similar kind of themes as the Adidas ad, actually. So sort of taking points of humour about British culture, and especially when we travel abroad, our willingness to adapt and speak the language and try out different food is often something poked fun at, sometimes rightly. And yeah, this kind of really leans into that. And also just, it's a bit silly. It features Danny Dyer, it features Peter Crouch.
Right, and Tom Bassam's wheelhouse,
exactly,
basically.
Yeah, it kind of...
Working class hero.
It speaks to me in quite a lot of ways. And also, yeah, it harks a little bit back to Danny Dyer in one of my favourite films, The Business. So I don't know if you've seen that film. Great. I like it a lot of 80s sportswear. Yeah, that was really it. But as I've said, already admitted defeat because I feel like Sam's picked the winner here.
I would put Paddy Power in highly commended because they're a good example of they're a betting brand, obviously, but they are very keen to position themselves more as an entertainment brand that offers betting services, and that's what informs their marketing approach. We're not here to necessarily to kind of discuss the ethics of that, but I think it is clearly proving to be and continues to be a very effective marketing tool in how they approach their content. The sort of this mix of sort of offbeat humour and mischief. It's actually quite a compelling mix, and it appeals to the more sort of innocent side of gambling, perhaps. Like it's okay to have a flutter kind of thing. It's focusing more on the vibe like betting as part of a package of the wider sports experience, rather than a lot of other companies where they focus purely on odds. They try and get you through bet builders and free bets and stuff like that. Obviously, Paddy Power offers those, but chances are most people encounter Paddy Power and get into that sort of their ecosystem through their videos and their marketing campaigns, which is a very effective model. But I kind of feel in your case, Tom, it's definitely more of the same from them rather than being necessarily a standout.
Yeah, and actually the fact that they've kind of followed that up with quite effective like mini socials campaigns with, I think, the Exploding Heads, that comedy duo. Sometimes it's hard to pick out a single campaign, but I liked that ad. But I think in the interest of speeding this along a little bit, we should all agree that Typisch Deutsch is the winner in this category, and everyone should go watch it because it's a good ad. Coming down to our last few of our half-year awards. This one's got the longest title, and it's a chance for us to pick some fun. So this is the I don't believe in this idea award, sponsored by Cristiano Ronaldo's NFTs. It's not an official sponsorship, obviously.
Yeah, this isn't a branded. We're not looking for a brand.
No, this is not a branded segment. If people do want to do branded segments, reach out to me and we can have a conversation. But this is not a branded segment. Ed, which idea do you not believe in, and why do you wish that was sponsored by Cristiano Ronaldo's NFTs?
I would say my pick is Premier League clubs repeatedly doing deals with little-known betting firms. I'm walking on
shots fired at Crystal Palace.
Well, it's not just Palace. There are other football clubs, and indeed white label betting brands are available. I sort of feel like I'm slightly treading on eggshells here, considering some of the brands and the pushback they've had, and the legal warnings they've given to some publications who have perhaps questioned the legitimacy of the betting brands in question. You can look those up online if you want in your own time, but a lot of these deals that have been signed against ahead of the new season, I mean, naming the clubs you mentioned, Palace, there's Wolves, there's Leicester. A lot of these have been described as record deals without any valuations being put on them. But I think it kind of, these deals, for me, this is probably naive, but for me, I just find it really odd that, the biggest domestic soccer league in the world and clubs are doing deals with brands that are just sort of, it almost feels like they're sort of not begging for them, but I just find it odd that they're repeatedly going back to the gambling gravy train, even at this stage. Now, it's offering, in theory, good revenue, good value deal, and maybe you can't begrudge them looking to sort of cash in before the front of shirt betting sponsorship ban comes in I think it's 2 seasons time. But I think what this is showing is that if you're a middling Premier League team, where you're not in the top 6 necessarily, your commercial strength is kind of just as precarious as your league status. Maybe I'm being naive and thinking commercial teams in Premier League clubs should be doing a better job, but I just kind of feel it in terms of what it says about the sort of commercial fortunes of Premier League clubs. I think aside from it being quite unimaginative, I just don't think it's particularly a healthy way to do business. And I think it'll be interesting to see what they do when the ban does come in. Can they fill that revenue gap, or is there going to be this revenue discrepancy that they're not going to be able to fill in a couple of years' time?
I think they would be less concerned with it if these were companies that had an established presence in the UK. And
so if it was a Paddy Power, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the issue that people are taking with this. I think Josh Samar obviously did a really big deep dive into the Palace deal, and the potential issues with that. I found it interesting in that article that right at the very bottom, there's a paragraph which basically says there's a loophole in British gambling regulations, which means this is allowed. So that's kind of partially why we keep seeing them, I suppose. There's not really enough there to stop clubs from doing it, which I suppose is the difficult thing. But yeah, I agree with what you said about it being unimaginative. Clubs in the biggest revenue generating football league in the world should be able to think about how they attract, more premium brands outside of the top 6. So I agree with what I'd say. As a supporter of a team who has just done one of those deals, I think from speaking to other fans and seeing the social media reaction, people aren't too impressed.
I think much like Ronaldo's NFTs, it's a short-term view.
I can't believe he's still got them. Right, Sam, what is the idea that you don't believe in?
Bounce between a couple here, but I've landed on one mainly because I think it kind of mirrors the trajectory of Cristiano Ronaldo's NFTs. So the idea I don't believe in is sponsorship deals with Prime, the energy drink, essentially because the reason I think this kind of mirrors the NFT trend is because it sort of Prime burst onto the scene. I think it was last year, wasn't it? It burst whenever it was.
2022, it really kind of arrived.
Burst onto the scene, loads of hype around it, bottles selling for ridiculous amounts of money. I think some like retailers even had to put like security labels on the bottles because because they became, you know, that much of a lucrative kind of item for them. So they kind of built up all this demand, built up a load of hype through scarcity, and in like a weird way, Prime bottles almost became like a collectible, I guess. So all of these followers of Logan Paul and KSI, who are the two influencers who launched the brand, all of these young social media followers were desperate to get their hands on them. That obviously saw the revenue for the company soar, which meant that in order to build attention and build that brand, they went and did a load of sponsorship deals with football clubs like Bayern Munich, I think Arsenal as well. I think the LA Dodgers have a deal with them. Maybe the UFC and WWE also have deals with Prime, I think I'm right in saying. And now basically in the first half of 2024, what we've seen is that demand has dried up. Their revenue in the UK is 50% of what it was, I think, for the first quarter of the year compared to the same period 12 months earlier. And I imagine that a lot of those sports that did deals with Prime are probably sweating on whether they're going to be able to honour their payments. I know that sort of those deals, part of it will be the fact that those sports are able to leverage the platform that KSI and Logan Paul have and reach young audiences and whatever. But I think the WWE deal was described as the biggest sponsorship deal in that organisation's history. So it's not like there's no money involved, there's no money at stake here. So yeah, I think kind of it's an interesting example of a brand that kind of, you know, entered that energy drink market again, like I think BioSteel was the one that I wrote about last year, entered with loads of hype around it, but just didn't really think about how it was going to sustain itself beyond that hype period. And I think we're now seeing the result of that. So yeah, I think it kind of interestingly mirrors what happened with NFTs. And yeah, so I do not believe in sponsorship deals with Prime.
Yeah, I like it. I guess the only thing I would say about it is that the popularity of Logan Paul and KSI isn't going down anytime soon, and they are able to keep on pushing that brand.
Yeah, but ultimately they're just they're brand ambassadors, right? Brand ambassadors alone don't sell products. I think you need experts in, you know, retail and marketing around it to ensure that that brand is going to be making money in the long term. Which, forgive me, I know they're experts in building audiences, but I don't know if they're experts in necessarily convincing that audience to buy an energy drink for the next 10 years so that it's in a position where it's rivaling other energy drinks. No,
I mean, like, maybe the exit here is that it gets bought by a Gatorade or a Lucozade. Yeah. Before I let you dive in and utterly decapitate Sam's nomination, Ed, I'm going to come in with mine and then you can decide which one you want to take on first. The idea that I don't believe in is the Apple Vision Pro.
Steve McCaskill is spitting.
I know.
I can hear footsteps in the background. Hang on. Charging in.
The Apple Vision Pro looks like a great product. It seems like a really nice VR product. I guess I just don't believe in it as a way to enhance sports. I fundamentally, and this has been the case ever since, any time VR has made any kind of entrance into this market, is that I just do not see people sitting around watching anything, sport especially, as a collective experience. I think the thing I've learned in this, one of the things I've noticed in this Euros is that people enjoy watching sports together, especially big sporting events. And the bigger the sporting event, the less time you're going to want to spend on a VR headset watching it on your own. So it's never going to have that level of cut through and be able to be something that isn't ever more than a novelty to me. So that's why I don't believe in it. It can obviously enhance the viewing experience in a very specific way, but it will never enhance the collective viewing experience in the same way because, frankly, people aren't going to be able to afford them. They look dumb, and you've got to sit on your sofa. Kind of, it makes everything into a solo enterprise, and I just don't think that's what sports is about, and that's why I don't believe in it.
I'm kind of torn here because I agree with Sam that Prime drinks, just objectively, I think they're kind of the disposable vape of energy drinks. Like, they're ghastly. But and as sort of SportsPro's resident Luddite, as Steve likes to keep reminding me, I sort of have my skepticism about the Vision Pro as well. I mean, I haven't used it, so I don't think I can give it a fair judgment. I think if any company, though, is going to change people's habits for using something like the Vision Pro, it's going to be Apple. Like, when they launched the iPad, even a lot of skepticism. Even when they launched their AirPods, you know, what do you mean your headphones don't have cords on? They're just going to fall out of your ear, aren't they?
I think this is you really showing your like resistance to technology. People wanted iPods, people wanted iPhones, people wanted tablets.
No, I didn't say iPhones.
People want
I
AirPhones.
said that it was difficult to make a use case for a iPad when you already had an iPhone, but Apple managed to make that case. Tim Cook's interesting, the Apple CEO, because he is looking for his great legacy product. So he hasn't really built one since he's been CEO. He's kind of continued what Jobs done, by, you know, evolving the iPhone, evolving the iPad, sort of bits and pieces there. He's looking for his kind of magnum opus in terms of a product, and Apple has that desirability factor, and they've got that track record of changing habits. If they're able to do that with the Vision Pro, then I would argue that is arguably a bit better achievement than what they did with something like the iPhone or the iPod. So I think the jury's still out on that with your argument, Tom. I think it's too early to say in terms of whether it's going to land or not, but I do take your point. If we're going to discount my argument, I would lean more towards Sam's, but that's just me.
I definitely take Tom's argument. I've never been all in on VR, to be honest, myself. Maybe that's a question, right? Is like, who is this for? Is it for us, Tom? Is it for you and I who have watched sport a certain way for a very long time and aren't?
But it should be, because like people much younger than us aren't going to be able to pay for it, and people older, people
are their parents going to be able to pay for it? It's kind of, that's the thing, right? I agree the price point of it limits who is going to be able to buy it and who is going to use it, but also because of that price point, you don't need as many people to adopt it for it to kind of be considered a success necessarily. So I don't know if like who they're going after is the core sports fan like us, who are used to watching sport in a certain way and have been used to watching sport in that way for a long time. Yeah, I think it's people who do want that sort of more immersive experience, which is that kind of younger generation coming through, I guess. And as you say, they're not probably going to be the ones who are going to be able to buy it. They're going to have to beg their parents probably. But that's kind of the way I see it, if I'm being balanced on it.
Fair enough. Okay. All right. Well, in the interest of wrapping this podcast up before we run into the 2 hour mark, let's settle on that. So you're saying Prime. Ed, are you backing Prime?
I think I'm going to stick with mine.
Okay.
Deciding vote, Tom.
Yeah, or I leave it as a 3-way tie. I'm going to go with Ed. Because I actually think
Palace while they're down.
Because I just think that I think that Prime has the ability to. There's an exit for Prime.
But if there is an exit for Prime, is it kind of, it defeats the whole point of why Sports did the deal in the first place? They're doing that deal because it's Logan Paul and KSI.
But whatever happens in that exit, they're still going to be associated as ambassadors in some way with the brand. Like, it doesn't exist without them. So maybe that counts against my argument, but I think if there is an exit, they'll still be involved in it. Whereas I think that I think these short-term betting deals in the Premier League, and they are extremely short-term, and they could work counter to a longer-term vision in your sponsorship strategy, is a better argument.
Well, if we're going with mine, we need to send a certificate to a Net 88, but we can't find a UK address for them. So
yeah, that's very true. But we can also try. Who was the one that PC Game? Is that the Leicester one? They can't even get their own logo right. So that shows where we're at with these. Allegedly, all of that allegedly. Okay, all right, gents. I've really enjoyed half year awards. We'll come back with full year awards and do this all again, maybe with some criteria this time.
And trophies.
No, still paint certificates.
Budget set for 24-25.
Yeah, exactly.
If Jimmy Pitaro, Kathy Engelbert, the CEO of Adidas, and anyone else who is receiving an award could let us know what they think of their certificate so we can improve for next time, that'd be great.
That would be great. Yeah, Jimmy, and you've got me on speed dial, I know. Give me a shout. Ed, Sam, thank you very much for your time. We will be back with another episode of the SportsPro Podcast next week, where we will be wrapping up the Euros. So I'm looking forward to that one already. Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers, Tom.
Cheers, mate.